the man who shaped the century. Birth and family background. In the small Georgian town of Gori, nestled beneath the Caucasus Mountains in what was then a remote province of the Russian Empire, a child was born on December 18, 1878, who would one day hold the fate of hundreds of millions of people in his hands. His birth name was Joseph Jugashvili. The world would come to know him by another name entirely. Gori was not a place of comfort or opportunity. It was a rough market town, prone to clan violence, where feuds settled scores that courts refused to touch. The Caucasus as a whole sat uneasily within the Russian Empire, a region of fierce local pride, ancient languages, and deep resentment toward Russian authority. Georgian identity ran strong among its people, and the distance between Tiflis, the administrative capital, and St. Petersburg, where imperial decisions were made, was measured not merely in miles but in culture, language, and temperament. Iosib's father, Bessarion Jugashvili, was a cobbler, poorly paid and prone to drinking. He was a violent man, and his violence fell regularly upon both his wife and his son. Historians, including Simon Sebag Montefiore, drawing on Georgian language sources and local testimonies largely ignored by earlier biographers, have documented that young Iosib was beaten frequently by his father. Whether those beatings forged something hard and retaliatory in his character, or whether they merely accelerated tendencies already present, remains a matter of interpretation. What is clear is that Bessarion's presence in the household diminished over time. He drifted away, falling further into alcoholism, and eventually died in Tiflis in poverty. The figure who remained constant was his mother, Ekaterine, known as Kik. She was a deeply religious woman, a hard worker who took in laundry and sewing to keep her son fed. She had already buried 3 children before Iosib survived infancy. She poured her ambitions into him with an intensity that bordered on ferocity. She wanted him educated. She wanted him to become a priest. That ambition would shape the next decade of his life, even as it ultimately produced something she had not intended. As a child, Iosib suffered 2 significant physical setbacks. A bout of smallpox left his face permanently pockmarked, a feature he was deeply self-conscious about in adulthood, and which photographers were quietly instructed to minimize in official images. A carriage accident, possibly combined with a blood infection, left his left arm shorter than his right and permanently stiff at the elbow, exempting him from military service decades later. These physical marks on a boy growing up in a culture where toughness was not merely admired, but required shaped someone fiercely sensitive to perceived disrespect or weakness. Stephen Kotkin, in his first volume on Stalin, argues that this sensitivity to insult and status became one of the most consistent threads running through his entire life. Sources used: Simon Sebag Montefiore, Young Stalin, pages to be verified against edition used. Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Paradoxes of Power, 1878–1928, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert Service, Stalin, A Biography, pages to be verified against edition used. Education. At the urging of his mother and with the support of a local priest who recognized his intelligence, Iosib was enrolled in the Gori Church School in 1888. He was 9 years old and learned Russian there for the first time, studying it as something close to a foreign language. He proved to be an exceptional student, competitive and driven, reading far beyond what was assigned, displaying a memory that impressed his teachers. He also displayed, from early on, a capacity to lead his peers while simultaneously watching them with calculating eyes. In 1894, he won a scholarship to the Tiflis Spiritual Seminary, one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the Caucasus. His mother was elated. The seminary was intended to produce priests for the Georgian Orthodox Church, and its curriculum was rigorous in scripture, classical languages, and theology. But it was also, paradoxically, a greenhouse for radical thought. Georgian students, chafing under Russian cultural dominance, and exposed to forbidden literature smuggled past the monks who monitored their reading, gravitated towards socialist and nationalist ideas with remarkable frequency. The seminary's regime was oppressive by design. Monks conducted regular inspections of students' belongings, confiscating prohibited books. The response among many students was not obedience but defiance and ingenuity. Joseph began reading contraband texts, Victor Hugo, banned Georgian literature, and eventually the works of Karl Marx. He joined a secret reading circle, a pattern of clandestine organization he would practice for the rest of his life. His academic performance deteriorated not because he lacked ability, but because he had redirected his intellectual energy. By 1899, he was expelled from the seminary, the official reason given as failure to appear for examinations. Whether he was pushed or whether he chose to leave on his own terms has been debated. What is not disputed is that by this point, the church had lost him entirely. He left Tiflis carrying Marxist convictions, an organizational instinct sharpened by years of conspiratorial reading groups, and a profound familiarity with texts of all kinds, sacred and secular, a characteristic that would make him an unusually well-read political operative in an era of ideologically sophisticated revolutionaries. Sources used: Simon Sebag Montefiore, Young Stalin, pages to be verified against edition used. Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Paradoxes of Power, 1878–1928, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert C. Tucker, Stalin as Revolutionary, pages to be verified against edition used. Becoming a Revolutionary. The decade between leaving the seminary and the Russian Revolution of 1917 was lived largely in the shadows. Iosif Jughashvili moved through the Caucasus and beyond as a professional revolutionary, organizing workers, writing pamphlets, raising funds by illegal means, and surviving a cycle of arrests and escapes that would have destroyed men of weaker nerve. He joined the Georgian Social Democratic movement and aligned himself with the Bolshevik faction after Lenin split with the Mensheviks in 1903. He was drawn to Lenin's conception of a disciplined, centralized, professional revolutionary party rather than the looser, more democratic model the Mensheviks preferred. The Bolshevik model suited his temperament, hierarchical, conspiratorial, and demanding total commitment. Between 1902 and 1913, he was arrested by the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, at least 7 times and exiled to Siberia on multiple occasions. He escaped from exile repeatedly, displaying both physical endurance and a contempt for authority that never wavered. These years in Siberian exile were brutal but also formative. He read constantly, debated fellow exiles, and refined his thinking. They also hardened him against sentiment. Men who could not survive that world he did not respect. The period also produced one of the most controversial episodes of his revolutionary career. The Tiflis Bank robbery of 1907, known among revolutionaries as an expropriation, was an armed robbery of a state bank convoy in the heart of Tiflis that killed dozens of people and netted the Bolsheviks a substantial sum of money. The operation was organized by a close associate named Kamo, but Stalin is widely believed by historians including Montefiore and Kotkin to have been centrally involved in its planning. It was exactly the kind of violent, high-stakes operation that other socialist factions condemned as criminal and that Lenin privately valued for keeping Bolshevik coffers funded. During these years, he also began writing political tracts, most notably his 1913 essay on Marxism and the national question, which impressed Lenin sufficiently to bring him into the Bolshevik inner circle at a higher level. Lenin referred to him admiringly as the wonderful Georgian. Stalin had adopted the revolutionary pseudonym by which history would remember him, derived from the Russian word for steel. Sources used: Simon Sebag Montefiore, Young Stalin, pages to be verified against edition used. Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Paradoxes of Power, 1878-1928, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert Service, Stalin, a biography, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert C. Tucker, Stalin as Revolutionary, pages to be verified against edition used. The Russian Revolution. When the February Revolution of 1917 brought down the Romanov dynasty, Stalin was in Siberian exile again. He returned to Petrograd in March, among the first senior Bolsheviks to arrive back in the capital, and took over the editorial leadership of Pravda alongside Lev Kamenev. During this early phase, before Lenin's return, both men adopted a position toward the provisional government that was more conciliatory than Lenin would later tolerate. When Lenin arrived in April with his uncompromising April theses demanding immediate socialist revolution, Stalin fell into line without public objection. That willingness to adjust, to subordinate his own position to the dominant line without visible embarrassment, was already becoming one of his most effective political tools. During the October Revolution, Stalin played a supporting role to Lenin and Trotsky, the latter organizing the Bolshevik seizure of power with organizational brilliance. Stalin's specific contributions to October have been overstated in Soviet mythology and understated by Trotsky's admirers in turn. Historians now generally view his role as significant but not central. He was on the editorial and organizational side of the Bolshevik apparatus rather than at the barricades. In the civil war that followed, his record was mixed in ways that mattered enormously to future political quarrels. He served as a political commissar on multiple fronts, most notably at Tsaritsyn, the city that would later bear his name. He clashed repeatedly with Trotsky, who commanded the Red Army, over military strategy and appointments. His conflicts with Trotsky's appointed military experts were bitter enough that Lenin was forced to intervene. These wartime quarrels planted seeds of hatred between Stalin and Trotsky that would bear lethal fruit over the following decades. Lenin, meanwhile, recognized Stalin's organizational reliability and gave him responsibilities in the new Soviet state, including the sensitive portfolio of nationalities policy, an enormous challenge in a country that contained over 100 distinct ethnic groups. Sources used: Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Paradoxes of Power, 1878-1928, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert Service, Stalin, a biography, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert C. Tucker, Stalin as Revolutionary, pages to be verified against edition used. Dmitry Volkogonov, Stalin, Triumph and Tragedy, pages to be verified against edition used. Rise to Power. In April 1922, the Bolshevik Party appointed Stalin General Secretary of the Central Committee. The position was administrative in nature, designed to manage the party's enormous organizational apparatus, the appointments, records, correspondence, and personnel files that kept a political machine functioning. Most of Stalin's rivals regarded it as a bureaucratic post beneath their intellectual dignity. Leon Trotsky, brilliant and contemptuous, preferred the ideological high ground. Zinoviev and Kamenev were busy with their own power bases in Petrograd and Moscow, respectively. Nikolai Bukharin was immersed in theoretical work. None of them understood until it was too late what Stalin had grasped immediately, that whoever controlled personnel controlled everything. Lenin suffered his first stroke in May 1922 and was increasingly incapacitated over the following year. During this period, he grew alarmed at Stalin's accumulating power and his behavior toward political opponents, including Lenin's own wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, whom Stalin reportedly abused over the telephone in a dispute about Lenin's medical care. Lenin dictated a series of notes now known as his testament, in which he assessed the senior Bolsheviks. Of Stalin, he wrote that the man had concentrated enormous power in his hands and that he was not certain Stalin would always know how to use it with sufficient caution. He specifically recommended that Stalin be removed from the position of General Secretary. Lenin died in January 1924. Stalin's management of the funeral, including his role as pallbearer and public eulogist, reinforced his image as Lenin's closest disciple. Crucially, he also maneuvered to ensure that Lenin's testament was not read publicly at the party congress where it might have damaged him. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who feared Trotsky more than they feared Stalin, supported suppressing it. What followed over the next 4 years was a masterclass in political elimination. Stalin first allied with Zinoviev and Kamenev against Trotsky, then turned against Zinoviev and Kamenev in alliance with Bukharin, then finally turned against Bukharin. Each alliance served its immediate purpose and was discarded. Trotsky was expelled from the party in 1927 and exiled from the Soviet Union in 1929, eventually finding refuge in Mexico, where Stalin's agents murdered him in 1940. Zinoviev and Kamenev were expelled, reinstated, and expelled again, their fates growing steadily darker. Bukharin, the most intellectually gifted of the group and once Lenin's favorite theorist, was eventually arrested and executed in 1938. By the end of the 1920s, Stalin stood effectively alone at the summit of Soviet power. Kotkin's analysis emphasizes that Stalin's rise was not merely a product of cunning, but reflected real organizational advantages and genuine political intelligence. He was not simply lucky. He read political situations with precision, understood the ideological language of Bolshevism well enough to always appear orthodox, and exploited his opponent's errors with patience and consistency. Sources used: Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Paradoxes of Power, 1878–1928, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert Service, Stalin, A Biography, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert C. Tucker, Stalin as Revolutionary, pages to be verified against edition used. Dmitry Volkogonov, Stalin, Triumph and Tragedy, pages to be verified against edition used. Oleg K. H. Levniuk, Stalin, New Biography of a Dictator, pages to be verified against edition used. Industrialization. By 1929, the year Stalin declared the Great Turn, the Soviet Union remained an overwhelmingly rural country. Its industrial base was real but modest, its military capacity limited by comparison with the European great powers, and its agricultural system, still largely based on small peasant farms, was producing neither the food surplus nor the capital accumulation that the leadership believed was necessary for survival. Stalin's response was the first 5-year plan, launched in 1928 and declared completed ahead of schedule in 1932, followed by a second and third. The scale of what was attempted was staggering. Entire industrial cities were built from open ground. Magnitogorsk, a vast steel complex in the Ural Mountains, rose from bare steppe within years. Hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them peasants driven off the land by collectivization, were channeled into factories, construction sites, and mines. Coal production expanded dramatically, as did steel, electricity generation, and heavy machinery manufacturing. By 1940, the Soviet Union had become one of the world's major industrial powers, a transformation of genuine historical magnitude. But the human cost was embedded in every ton of steel produced. Workers lived in overcrowded barracks, faced food rationing that left them chronically malnourished, and worked under quota systems that criminalized underperformance. Industrial accidents were common and rarely investigated properly. Managers who failed to meet targets faced accusations of sabotage, which could mean arrest, imprisonment in the Gulag, or execution. The pace of industrialization was driven not by rational economic planning, but by political terror, and the decisions made under those conditions were frequently wasteful and destructive. Sheila Fitzpatrick's work on Stalinist society complicates simple narratives of pure victimhood by documenting that many Soviet citizens, particularly young workers and engineers who genuinely believed in the project, experienced these years with enthusiasm and a sense of historical purpose. The period created a generation of Soviet professionals whose loyalty to the system was real, even as the system ground others beneath it. This complexity is important. The Stalinist industrialization program was simultaneously a genuine transformation and a catastrophe measured in human lives, forced labor, and systemic violence. Historians debate whether the pace of industrialization was economically necessary, or whether a more gradual approach could have achieved comparable results at a fraction of the human cost. The Soviet Union's ability to produce tanks, artillery, and aircraft during World War II lends the industrialization program a strategic retrospective justification that some historians accept and others reject. What is not disputed is that, without the industrial base built in the 1930s, the Soviet Union could not have survived the German invasion of 1941. Sources used: Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929–1941, pages to be verified against edition used. Sheila Fitzpatrick, On Stalin's Team, pages to be verified against edition used. Oleg K.H. Levniuk, Stalin, New Biography of a Dictator, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert Service, Stalin, A Biography, pages to be verified against edition used. Collectivization. Simultaneously with industrialization, Stalin launched the forced collectivization of Soviet agriculture, a campaign to abolish private peasant farming and consolidate the countryside into collective farms, known as kolkhozy, under state direction. The process was violent from the beginning. Peasants who resisted surrendering their land, livestock, and tools were subjected to organized coercion, deportation, and death. The category invented to justify this violence was the kulak, nominally a wealthy peasant, but in practice, a designation applied with enormous arbitrariness to anyone who resisted, complained, or simply fell under suspicion. Hundreds of thousands of kulak families were deported to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the far north, where many died from exposure, starvation, and disease. Stalin himself, in correspondence with subordinates, spoke of the need to liquidate the kulaks as a class, language that translated into mass atrocity on the ground. The consequences for Soviet agriculture were devastating. Peasants slaughtered their livestock rather than hand them over to collective farms. Between 1929 and 1933, the Soviet livestock population collapsed catastrophically. Grain procurement quotas were maintained, and in some regions increased even as harvests failed, and the result was a famine of historical enormity. Ukraine, the most agriculturally productive region of the Soviet Union, suffered the worst. Millions died of starvation between 1932 and 1933, a catastrophe now known as the Holodomor, meaning death by hunger. Anne Applebaum's meticulous scholarship documents how the famine in Ukraine was not a mere byproduct of mismanagement, but was shaped by specifically targeted policies. Travel restrictions that prevented starving peasants from leaving their villages to search for food, blacklisting of villages that failed to meet quotas, and systematic confiscation of any remaining food supplies. Whether this constitutes genocide remains a question of legal definition and political controversy. Most Ukrainian and many Western governments have declared it genocide. The scholarly debate turns on questions of intent, whether Stalin sought to kill Ukrainians as Ukrainians or primarily sought to crush peasant resistance to collectivization and extract grain regardless of consequences. The suffering itself is beyond historical dispute. Kazakhstan also experienced catastrophic mortality, with estimates of deaths in the hundreds of thousands to over 1 million, as nomadic herding populations were forced into collective farms wholly unsuited to their way of life. Oleg Levniuk's archival research shows that Stalin was aware of mass starvation as it was occurring and made no meaningful effort to alleviate it while simultaneously maintaining export of grain abroad. This evidence is central to assessments of personal culpability. Sources used: Anne Applebaum, Red Famine, pages to be verified against edition used. Oleg Levniuk, Stalin, New Biography of a Dictator, pages to be verified against edition used. Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929–1941, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert C. Tucker, Stalin in Power, pages to be verified against edition used. Orlando Figs, The Whisperers, pages to be verified against edition used. The Great Purge. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin initiated a wave of political terror on a scale that remains difficult to comprehend. The instrument was the NKVD, the Soviet secret police under the command of Nikolai Yezhov, and its targets ranged from the highest levels of the party and military to ordinary factory workers, collective farm members, ethnic minorities, and anyone whose biography contained a suspicious element. A relative abroad, a period of residence in a foreign country, a grandfather who had once owned land. The most theatrical aspect of the Purge was its show trials. 3 major public trials were staged in Moscow between 1936 and 1938, in which prominent old Bolsheviks, men who had fought alongside Lenin and Stalin for decades, confessed in open court to crimes of breathtaking improbability: sabotage, terrorism, espionage for Nazi Germany, Japan, Britain, and Trotsky simultaneously. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, Rykov, and dozens of others were put before judges and the world's press and confessed to having plotted the destruction of the Soviet state. Then they were shot. How these confessions were obtained has been extensively documented through archival research. NKVD investigators used sleep deprivation, physical torture, and threats against family members. They also exploited the ideological formation of old Bolsheviks, some of whom convinced themselves that a final act of loyalty to the party required confirming whatever narrative the party needed. Arthur Koestler's fictional rendering of this psychological process in Darkness at Noon captured the dynamic in ways that later historical research has largely validated. Beyond the show trials, the Purge operated through mass operations. NKVD Order 447, signed in August 1937, set numerical quotas for arrests and executions by region. Local NKVD offices competed to exceed their quotas. The result was the murder of at least 680,000 people in 1937 and 1938 alone, based on archival figures confirmed by historians including Levniuk. Total repression statistics for the Stalin period, including Gulag deaths and deaths from deportations, run into the millions. The military purge had consequences that rippled directly into World War II. 3 of 5 Soviet marshals were shot, along with a devastating proportion of senior commanders at every level. The Red Army entered the German War of 1941 significantly decapitated. Whether the purge was driven by Stalin's paranoid fear of a potential military coup, by ideological conviction, by a calculated attempt to eliminate all possible rivals and challengers, or by some combination of all 3 remains debated among historians. Kotkin's analysis leans toward understanding Stalin as genuinely believing in conspiracies, while simultaneously using terror as a political instrument. Levniuk emphasizes the institutional dynamics of the NKVD and the way the terror fed itself once set in motion. Orlando Figs' work captures what the terror meant at the level of ordinary Soviet life: neighbors informing on neighbors, children denouncing parents, entire families erased from official photographs. A culture of surveillance and fear was not merely imposed from above but participated in from below, a phenomenon that leaves moral and historical complexity that cannot be resolved by any simple narrative. Sources used: Oleg K.H. Levniuk, Stalin, New Biography of a Dictator, pages to be verified against edition used. Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929–1941, pages to be verified against edition used. Orlando Figs, The Whisperers, pages to be verified against edition used. Simon Sebag Montefiore, Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert C. Tucker, Stalin in Power, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert Service, Stalin, A Biography, pages to be verified against edition used. Stalin Government. The Stalin era produced one of history's most elaborately constructed personality cults. His image appeared everywhere, in factories and schools, on the sides of mountains, in paintings commissioned to show him standing among adoring crowds of workers and children. Soviet cinema, under strict ideological control, produced films in which his wisdom guided every outcome. Poets competed to praise him in language borrowed from religious veneration. He was referred to as the father of nations, the brilliant genius of humanity, the best friend of Soviet children. The 1936 Soviet Constitution, drafted under his supervision, was technically one of the most democratic documents in the world. It guaranteed freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and universal suffrage. Its relationship to the actual practice of Soviet governance was purely cosmetic. It served primarily as propaganda, proof that the Soviet Union was a lawful state, produced and circulated precisely as the Great Purge was reaching its peak. Education expanded rapidly under Stalin, and this is not a trivial point. Literacy rates rose dramatically, universities multiplied, and technical education created the engineers and scientists who built Soviet industry and eventually its nuclear program. At the same time, the content of education was tightly controlled. History textbooks were rewritten whenever political needs demanded it. Scientists who worked in fields that conflicted with ideological preferences faced persecution. Most notoriously, geneticists were suppressed in favor of the pseudoscientific theories of Trofim Lysenko, whose rejection of Mendelian genetics in favor of an ideologically acceptable alternative set Soviet agricultural science back by a generation. The arts lived in a state of controlled creativity. Some of the Soviet Union's most gifted writers, composers, and filmmakers produced work of genuine quality within the constraints imposed by socialist realism, the official aesthetic doctrine requiring art to depict life as it should be rather than as it was. Dmitry Shostakovich survived by navigating between artistic integrity and political necessity with extraordinary skill, though not without terrible costs to his peace of mind and creative freedom. Those who failed to navigate those waters faced consequences ranging from censorship to the Gulag. Sources used: Sheila Fitzpatrick, On Stalin's Team, pages to be verified against edition used. Orlando Figs, The Whisperers, pages to be verified against edition used. Simon Sebag Montefiore, Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert Service, Stalin, A Biography, pages to be verified against edition used. Foreign Policy. Stalin's foreign policy in the 1930s moved through several distinct phases, each shaped by his reading of the international situation and his overriding goal of keeping the Soviet Union out of any major war until it had built sufficient industrial and military capacity to survive one. Through the early and mid-1930s, the Soviet Union pursued collective security arrangements with Western democracies, seeking to build alliances against the rising threat of Nazi Germany. The effort largely failed. Britain and France pursued appeasement of Hitler at Munich in 1938 without consulting Moscow, confirming Stalin's suspicion that Western powers hoped to direct German aggression eastward. In August 1939, Stalin concluded the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, a non-aggression agreement that stunned the world. The pact's secret protocols divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Eastern Poland, and Bessarabia fell within the Soviet sphere. Stalin moved quickly to claim these territories. The Soviet invasion of Finland in November 1939 proved far more costly than expected, the Finnish army resisting with a tenacity that exposed serious weaknesses in Soviet military performance. The Baltic states were absorbed into the Soviet Union in 1940 following ultimatums. Eastern Poland was occupied following the German invasion of Poland, and thousands of Polish officers and intellectuals were murdered by the NKVD in what became known as the Katyn Massacre. Stalin's calculations in pursuing the pact remain debated. He gained roughly 20 months of additional time to prepare Soviet defenses, though historians differ significantly on how effectively that time was used. Jeffrey Roberts argues that Stalin genuinely sought to avoid war and used the pact as a defensive maneuver within an impossible strategic environment. Critics point to the Soviet military's continued disorganization in June 1941 as evidence that the time gained was partly wasted. Sources used: Jeffrey Roberts, Stalin's Wars, pages to be verified against edition used. Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929–1941, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert Service, Stalin, A Biography, pages to be verified against edition used. Dmitry Volkogonov, Stalin, Triumph and Tragedy, pages to be verified against edition used. World War II. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. 3 million German and Axis troops struck across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Soviet military, despite intelligence warnings from multiple sources including British signals intelligence and Soviet spy networks, was catastrophically unprepared. Stalin had convinced himself that Germany would not attack in 1941, or that any German moves would be preceded by diplomatic demands he could negotiate. He dismissed or suppressed intelligence that contradicted this conviction. The first weeks of the war were a disaster of nearly incomprehensible scale. Entire Soviet army groups were encircled and destroyed. In the Minsk and Kiev encirclements alone, the Germans captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. The Soviet Air Force was largely destroyed on the ground in the opening days. Stalin, by multiple accounts, suffered a psychological collapse, withdrawing to his dacha at Kuntsevo for several days as his government struggled to function without direction. Whether this represented genuine breakdown or a calculated political maneuver to force his inner circle to come to him and beg him to continue leading remains disputed. Most historians, including Kotkin and K.H. Levniuk, lean toward genuine crisis, though Stalin's political instincts reasserted themselves rapidly. He returned to command, delivered a radio address in July that struck a markedly different tone from standard Soviet rhetoric, appealing to Russian patriotism and historical identity rather than ideology alone, calling the Soviet people brothers and sisters. He remained in Moscow during the German advance in October 1941, when most of the government was evacuated, a decision of real psychological significance that reinforced his credibility as wartime leader. The Battle of Moscow in late 1941 halted the German advance for the first time, assisted by the onset of a brutal Russian winter and the arrival of Siberian divisions transferred from the Far East after intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack the Soviet Union. Leningrad was placed under siege that lasted nearly 900 days, costing the civilian population roughly 1 million lives from starvation, exposure, and bombardment. The suffering of Leningrad's people represented one of the most prolonged civilian ordeals of the entire war. The turning point came at Stalingrad, where from August 1942 through February 1943, German and Soviet forces fought a battle of annihilation in the ruins of a city bearing Stalin's name. The eventual encirclement and destruction of German Field Marshal Paulus's Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 men destroyed or captured, marked a shift from which German military initiative on the Eastern Front never recovered. Richard Overwy's analysis of Soviet war production during this period demonstrates how the relocation of hundreds of factories east of the Ural Mountains in the autumn of 1941, an organizational achievement of remarkable scope, enabled Soviet industry to outproduce Germany in tanks and artillery from 1942 onward. At Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history ended in decisive Soviet victory. From that point, the strategic initiative belonged to the Red Army. Stalin's development as a military commander is itself a subject of historical revision. He began the war micromanaging operations with catastrophic results, overriding professional military judgment with political considerations. Over time, he learned to work more effectively with commanders like Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasylovsky, delegating operational decisions while retaining strategic and political control. At Tehran in November 1943 and Yalta in February 1945, Stalin met with Roosevelt and Churchill. He proved himself a formidable diplomatic operator, patient, focused, and skilled at exploiting the divisions between his Western allies and their genuine dependence on Soviet military performance to secure post-war arrangements favorable to Soviet interests. The shape of post-war Eastern Europe was substantially determined by what the Red Army had already conquered by the time these conferences concluded. Berlin fell to Soviet forces in May 1945. The victory came at a cost the Soviet Union bore far more heavily than any other participant. Estimates of Soviet war dead range from 27 million to over 30 million, figures that represent roughly 1 in 7 Soviet citizens. Every family in the country lost someone. The magnitude of that sacrifice has shaped Russian historical memory ever since. Sources used: Richard Overwy, Russia's War, pages to be verified against edition used. Jeffrey Roberts, Stalin's Wars, pages to be verified against edition used. Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929-1941, pages to be verified against edition used. Oleg K.H. Levniuk, Stalin, New Biography of a Dictator, pages to be verified against edition used. Dmitry Volkogonov, Stalin, Triumph and Tragedy, pages to be verified against edition used. Simon Sebag Montefiore, Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar, pages to be verified against edition used. Post-war USSR. Victory transformed Stalin's international stature without softening his domestic methods. Soviet forces remained in Eastern Europe, and over the following years, communist governments loyal to Moscow were installed across Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. Yugoslavia under Josip Broz Tito followed its own independent path and was expelled from the Soviet bloc in 1948, an outcome that infuriated Stalin and demonstrated the limits of his control over ideologically allied but nationally distinct states. The Cold War with the United States and its allies began taking shape almost immediately after the German defeat. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in 1946 named the division publicly. Soviet intelligence had penetrated the Manhattan Project, and in 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear weapon, ending the American monopoly far sooner than Western intelligence had anticipated. Stalin had prioritized the atomic program with the same pressure-driven urgency he applied to all strategic priorities. Inside the Soviet Union, the post-war years brought a new wave of ideological tightening. Zhdanovism, named for ideology chief Andrei Zhdanov, imposed stricter controls on cultural and intellectual life. Writers, filmmakers, and scientists again found themselves navigating demands for conformity. Returning Soviet prisoners of war who had survived German captivity faced suspicion. Having been captured, was treated as potential evidence of disloyalty. Many were sent directly from German camps to Soviet ones. Reconstruction of the devastated Western Soviet Union proceeded under conditions of enormous sacrifice for ordinary people, with priority given to military and heavy industrial capacity over consumer welfare. Famine struck again in 1946 and 1947, killing hundreds of thousands in Ukraine and other regions, a catastrophe less well known than the 1932 to 1933 famine, but documented in archival research by K.H. Levniuk and others. Sources used: Oleg K.H. Levniuk, Stalin, New Biography of a Dictator, pages to be verified against edition used. Simon Sebag Montefiore, Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert Service, Stalin, A Biography, pages to be verified against edition used. Jeffrey Roberts, Stalin's Wars, pages to be verified against edition used. Final years. By the late 1940s, the man who had ruled the Soviet Union for 2 decades was aging visibly. Stalin in his final years was increasingly reclusive, suspicious even of the inner circle that had survived decades in proximity to power only through a combination of loyalty, subservience, and luck. He slept during the day and worked through the night, summoning Politburo members to late dinners at Kontsivo that lasted until the early hours of the morning, mixing heavy drinking with political conversation and cinema screenings. To leave early was not permitted. To fail to laugh at his jokes risked dangerous misinterpretation. The men around him, figures like Molotov, Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Mikoyan, had survived by learning to read his moods and to never place their own interests visibly above his. Montefiore's research into this court culture documents an atmosphere of constant low-grade terror. Men who had helped run a totalitarian state lived in fear of the man at its center. Molotov's own wife had been arrested in 1949 on charges of Zionist sympathies, and Molotov continued to attend Politburo meetings and work alongside Stalin without outwardly protesting. In January 1953, Soviet newspapers announced the discovery of a conspiracy among Kremlin doctors, mostly Jewish, who had allegedly plotted to murder Soviet leaders through deliberate medical mistreatment. The doctors' plot appeared to many observers, then and since, as the preparatory signal for a new wave of purges targeting Jewish citizens specifically, and potentially aimed at destabilizing the existing inner circle. Whether Stalin was planning another mass terror operation, or whether the doctor's plot reflected simply a fragment of his deteriorating mental state cannot be definitively established. The evidence, as assessed by K.H. Levniuk and Kotkin, suggests a genuine campaign was being prepared. It did not happen. On the morning of March 1, 1953, Stalin's guards found him lying on the floor of his room at Kontsivo. He had suffered a massive stroke. His inner circle, summoned urgently, delayed calling medical help for reasons that have never been fully clarified, though most historians attribute the delay primarily to fear of making a wrong decision in a situation without precedent rather than to any active intention to let him die. He died on March 5, 1953. His funeral produced scenes of mass grief that were also, in part, politically managed spectacle. Crowds attempting to see his body caused a stampede in Moscow that killed hundreds of people, one of those events that serves as an inadvertent metaphor for his entire reign. Sources used: Simon Sebag Montefiore, Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar, pages to be verified against edition used. Oleg K.H. Levniuk, Stalin, New Biography of a Dictator, pages to be verified against edition used. Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Neither Peace Nor War, 1941–1953, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert Service, Stalin, a biography, pages to be verified against edition used. Legacy. No figure of the 20th century generates more interpretive disagreement than Joseph Stalin, and that disagreement is not merely academic. It reflects genuinely different moral frameworks, national experiences, and political investments. Among those who assess his legacy most harshly, which includes the overwhelming majority of Western historians and the scholarly consensus represented by works from Applebaum, Figs, K.H. Levniuk, and Kotkin, the accounting is clear and damning. Millions died as a direct consequence of his decisions. In the Ukrainian famine, in the Gulag, in the Great Purge, in the deportation of entire ethnic groups, in the conditions of collectivization, and in the catastrophe of 1941 that his strategic miscalculations helped produce. The regimes he imposed on Eastern Europe after 1945 represented decades of political repression for over 100 million people. His model of governance demonstrated that a modern state could mobilize mass violence against its own population on an industrial scale. The question of whether the Soviet Union's industrialization and its victory in World War II justify any of these costs is one that historians treat with great care. Richard Overwy acknowledges the strategic reality. Without the industrial base built in the 1930s, without the Soviet army that ultimately defeated Nazi Germany, European history takes a radically different and almost certainly far darker shape. This is not a trivial counterfactual. But Overwy and others are careful to note that necessity does not become justification, and that many of the specific decisions that maximized human suffering were not militarily or economically necessary by any defensible calculation. Within Russia, Stalin's reputation has experienced a complex and troubling rehabilitation since the Soviet Union's collapse. Polling data from the 2010s showed significant percentages of Russians expressing admiration, or at minimum respect for Stalin, viewing him primarily through the lens of World War II victory and national greatness. This tendency has been encouraged by official historical narratives under Vladimir Putin that emphasize Soviet military achievement while minimizing or contextualizing the repressions. The Stalin-era archives opened in the 1990s and early 2000s, which enabled the most detailed historical research ever conducted on his regime, have been partially reclosed or made more difficult to access in subsequent years, a development that historians regard with considerable concern. In Ukraine, Georgia, the Baltic states, Kazakhstan, and Poland, historical memory runs in a starkly different direction. For these nations, Stalin's legacy is experienced as colonial violence, forced famine, deportation, and the suppression of national identity. The Holodomor's recognition as genocide by an expanding number of states reflects how differently the same historical facts register depending on whose experience is centered. Robert Tucker's psychological interpretation, developed across 2 volumes, presents Stalin as a man whose early experiences of shame, humiliation, and violence produced a personality organized around the need for domination and the destruction of perceived enemies. Kotkin's more structural approach argues that Marxist-Leninist ideology provided the essential framework without which Stalin's behavior cannot be understood. He was not simply a psychopath, but a true believer in a system that made his worst impulses ideologically virtuous. What seems beyond serious dispute is the sheer scale of the history he made, and the sheer weight of the suffering he caused. He transformed a vast rural empire into an industrial power in a single generation. He led that power through the most destructive war in human history and emerged victorious. He shaped the geopolitics of the second half of the 20th century in ways that remain operative today. All of that is true, and none of it erases the millions who died to make it so, or the millions more who lived in fear for the entirety of their adult lives. History has few figures who demand this much from those who try to understand them. Stalin does not permit easy conclusions. He requires sustained attention to contradiction, to the relationship between ideology and violence, between state power and human cost, between historical achievement and moral catastrophe. The reckoning is not finished. It may never be entirely finished. But it continues in archives, in classrooms, in the ongoing arguments of historians who understand that getting this history right is not merely an academic obligation, but a moral one. Sources used: Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Paradoxes of Power, 1878, 1928, pages to be verified against edition used. Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929-1941, pages to be verified against edition used. Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Neither Peace Nor War, 1941-1953, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert C. Tucker, Stalin in Power, pages to be verified against edition used. Oleg K. H. Levniuk, Stalin, New Biography of a Dictator, pages to be verified against edition used. Richard Overwy, Russia's War, pages to be verified against edition used. Anne Applebaum, Red Famine, pages to be verified against edition used. Orlando Figs, The Whisperers, pages to be verified against edition used. Robert Service, Stalin, A Biography, pages to be verified against edition used. Dmitry Volkogonov, Stalin, Triumph and Tragedy, pages to be verified against edition used. Simon Sebag Montefiore, Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar, pages to be verified against edition used.